So good morning, everyone. My name is Miranda Stiers, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs. I'm a prevention program specialist here at the California Partnership. And today I'm joined by Sarah Diamond, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Hi, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. My name is Sarah Diamond. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I am the lead prevention and community engagement specialist at Center for Community Solutions, a dual DV rape crisis center in San Diego, California.
Right, thank you. And for folks who have attended before, we're always going to be doing an opening circle, just so we know who is joining us and have a chance to check in and say hello. I know some folks have already started doing that in the chat. Today's topic is going to be violence prevention and porn literacy. So why you should include porn literacy in your violence prevention programming and how to do it. So we're going to have a lot of discussion, and there will, of course, be time for questions and answers. So looking forward to the conversation. We also acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory and homelands of California Native people, and these nations include over 120 federally recognized tribes and many other non-recognized tribes that are all very culturally diverse. We thank these nations for their generosity, and we keep them in our hearts and thoughts as we are in this space today, this week, and every day. I'm joining from Nisenan, Miwok, and Maidu land, and I'm going to put a link in the chat so folks can see whose land they are on. And let me go ahead and stop sharing so I can turn that over to Sarah. So folks can just check in, let us know what is your name, what agency you're joining from, and like I said, I'll put the link for the native lands in right now. And there is the link. And again, for anybody who is just joining, you can click on more in your toolbar, and then you can enable the chat transcription or closed captioning, which I know can be helpful for a lot of folks. All right, let's keep those introductions coming, and Sarah, it's all yours.
Great. Thank you all so much again for being here. I'm really excited to be with you this morning. I think we have a pretty jam-packed presentation that I hope you all will find engaging. It's not going to be me lecturing at you for the entire hour and a half. I just want to shout out some people that I see in here that I know: Christine, Arthi, Elise. It's nice to see you all. Holly. It's nice to have like a little bit of a crowd. But hi, everyone. Let me go ahead and share my screen really quickly. And let's zoom properly and then make sure that my sound is shared. All right, perfect. Great. So again, my name is Sarah Diamond. Pronouns are she, her, hers, and I work for a dual organization down in San Diego. I cannot really see people throughout this presentation. I can see Miranda. So Miranda, I'm going to kind of look to you for like head nods and things like that. But I'm excited. So let's go ahead and get started. If it'll work. All right, cool. So here is my overview for this presentation. I first want to unpack why we as violence preventionists should actually consider porn literacy. Why is this something that's important for us, for people who are doing violence prevention work, to think about it and to include into their curriculum? I want us to also think about what should we actually consider when it comes to porn literacy. And I mean, consider before teaching, before we like are ready to like put in our lesson plan or edit our lesson plans, or even like facilitate a conversation with young people. What should we actually consider? I'm going to give you tons of activities to do with youth. I think that my favorite part as a preventionist is always attending workshops where I walk away with tangible tools. And so I'm hoping that I'm going to give you some tangible tools, and they'll be broken down in different ways that I'm going to actually give you access to at the end. And then I want to talk about how can we field some difficult questions. I think a lot of times when it comes to porn or even other sex ed related topics, A lot of us as prevention educators might not be formally trained in like how to respond to these things. So how can we field the difficult questions? Again, we'll have resources and then a Q&A. And I also want to mention that work could not be done without one of my colleagues, Sarah Baer. We had presented at the National Sexual Assault Conference in 2018 on porn literacy and kind of how it can compare to other media literacy in the form of Disney and unpacking tropes in Disney. And so I just want to shout her out publicly. I could not be doing this work without her. So thank you, Sarah Baer. All right, so to get us started, we're actually going to do a kind of polling question, but this is at menti.com. So you can go to menti.com and type in the code 52101754, or you can click the link that Miranda is going to drop into the chat right now, and I will pull it up. Okay. So this is what Mentimeter looks like. Again, you can go to menti.com, use that code, or you click on the link that Miranda just dropped. Really quickly, this is an anonymous polling feature. This first slide, ask me anything, but you'll have access to it throughout the entire duration of the presentation. So you can actually ask me an anonymous question at any point in time, but I won't be checking these until the end. Of course, if you have other questions that you want to ask me in between, please feel free to unmute, raise your hand, put it in the chat, whatever works best for you. But if you don't want to ask in front of everyone, that's super fair. Then you can ask here. I can't really access the chat throughout the presentation. So this is the way that make sure that I don't miss your questions. But excuse me, my first question for you all is, what are your concerns when it comes to teaching porn literacy? You'll have up to 3 options. You can write 3 different words, but what are the concerns that you have as a violence preventionist, or even maybe someone who's not doing violence prevention, but is curious to, what are your concerns when it comes to actually facilitating conversations around porn? So I'm gonna give you all a moment or so, and hopefully we'll start to see things populate up on the screen. The first one, age appropriateness, trauma informed, absolutely. Keep them coming, please. I want to know, what are your concerns? Hopefully I'm going to address them today. But I think age appropriateness is always something that's really concerning when it comes to any form of sex education. I didn't mention it earlier, but my formal training is in sex ed. And so I came into the violence prevention field as a sex educator, and I truly believe you cannot do one without the other. And a lot of us as violence preventionists aren't actually taught what the age appropriate levels are, right? And so I'm hoping that we can think about that a little bit together. Students asking me, I'm assuming that might be students asking me the difficult questions, teaching in rural spaces, perpetuating violence, LGBTQIA inclusive, sex positive, agency pushback. Let's see, oh my goodness. Where are we? Glamorization of porn, navigating nuance, inappropriate questions, and age appropriateness. And those 2 pieces are larger because they're probably being entered in repeatedly. But all of these things are really like valid concerns as to why we might be nervous to actually facilitate conversations around porn. One that I haven't seen in here, which maybe could be from like agency pushback or school pushback, is parents. I think parents are a really, can be rather a concern, right, or a barrier to doing any type of sex education. And I would argue that violence prevention work is a form of sex education. It's a different type. It's not the standard, you know, STIs and contraceptives type of education, but it is sex education. And so I think any type of sex ed can often come with pushback from parents, because parents are thinking that if we're talking about sex, that means we're teaching their kids how to have sex. And we all know that that's not the case. Let's see if any other ones came up. Conservative spaces, absolutely. Again, all super valid reasons as to why we might fear or feel anxious or nervous or have concerns, right, about teaching porn literacy. So let's go ahead and go back to the PowerPoint. And I want to show you a video that I think really helps me kind of push and make the argument for why we should talk about porn literacy. This works. Miranda, please let me know if it doesn't.
Hiya, I'm Sue. This is Derek. We're here because your son just looked us up online, you know, to watch us.
Matt, darling, there's some people here to see you. So he watches you online?
Yeah, you know, on his laptop.
iPad, PlayStation,
His phone, your phone.
smart TV, projector.
Yeah, anyway, we usually perform for adults, but your son's just a kid. He might not know how relationships actually work. We don't even talk about consent, do we? Now we just get straight to it.
Yeah, and I'd never act like that in real life.
Hey, Maddie. You right?
Okay, Sandra, stay calm. You know what to do here. All right, Maddie. It sounds like it's time to have a talk about the difference between what you see online and real-life relationships. No judgment.
Many young Kiwis are using porn to learn about sex. Keep It Real online. Get help and advice at keepitrealonline.govt.nz.
Okay, so I love that video. I think it's a really great way to kind of capture why we should be talking about porn with young people, because one, they're accessing it, right? There is another video that I'm going to give you access to when I send out my resources, or when Miranda sends them out for me, but it's a little bit less appropriate for work maybe. So I'll send it to you. You can watch it on your own time. There's no nudity in it, but there are some sex toys. And so just because we're recording, I decided not to show that video, but I also think it's really fun. So this one was from New Zealand, and then the one I'm gonna send is from the US, but it's really about porn stars even saying that parents should be having these conversations. And as a sex educator, I firmly believe that sex education should start in the home. And what we provide is supplemental education as violence preventionists or educators out there. So let's talk a little bit more about so there's been a lot of debate, I think, over recent years as to how frequent young people are actually accessing pornography. And I have the study cited here, but there was like a literature review that looked at a bunch of different academic articles. And really what they were able to determine is that it's actually hard to determine how often young people are accessing pornography, although it's noted that it's a sizable minority. But there is some limited evidence that, one, among young people, overall sexually explicit media use may predict an increased risk of sexual risk behavior, and that sexually explicit media use may predict an increased risk of sexual aggression and or violence perpetration among boys in particular. I recognize that these are very binary studies. The studies that they looked at often say, you know, male and female or boys and girls, and that's because academia is unfortunately really binary. But this is what there is some limited research to show. And I would say it's also just really accessible, from Pornhub to OnlyFans to even, I'd say, TikTok or Instagram. There are many different social media platforms that young people are accessing where they're exposed to sexually explicit media, whether it's intentional or not. And a lot of the studies are also looking at, is it intentional porn use, meaning that they actually logged in and they were typing into their browser, you know, sex and whatever words that follow, or is it that they accidentally stumbled upon it? So I'm going to share an example of how I accidentally stumbled upon porn for the first time. So when I was 9 years old, this band here, Orgy, had come out with a single. I think it was called Blue Monday. It was a re-release of a song from the 80s. And I loved it. Thought it was my jam, had no idea what orgy meant. And so at 9 years old, I Googled orgy because I wanted to learn more about the band. And as you can imagine, I was not met with pictures of this band. I was met with sexually explicit content at 9 years old. And that was completely unintentional, right? So that was my first exposure to pornography, for internet pornography, right? Think about how easy it is to access porn nowadays, right? Without parents even knowing, right? As they said in that video, in the last video that we watched, you can access it on your PlayStation, on your Xbox, on your phone, on your tablets, right? On your computers, everywhere, right? And parents don't have to necessarily know about it, because I think youth are really tech savvy in a way that a lot of their parents are not. And so this is something that I know is happening. And while I'd say that the studies and the research are unsure, I think a lot of us have anecdotal experience of young people telling us that they themselves have watched pornography or have seen sexually explicit media. I remember in particular working with a group of young boys, and one of them saying to me that all girls liked being choked during sex. And as a violence preventionist, right, I was like, well, let's unpack that. Where did you learn that, first of all? And this young boy was really comfortable to say, well, that's all I ever see in porn. And in porn, girls get off from that and they moan and they do different things that indicate that they're enjoying it. And I was like, you know what, you're right. They're showing that, but let's unpack how porn isn't realistic. And so I think we probably all know of or have heard of instances where young people have had exposure to sexually explicit media. And I would say porn isn't the only type of sexually explicit media that exists out there, right? So they're seeing it everywhere, whether it's intentional or not. So what can we do about it? Well, I think porn literacy is one way that we can really start to unpack the things that we're seeing in pornography. Porn literacy is just a form of media literacy, right? And it's a framework from which people can critically examine and make sense of the sexual things that they are seeing. When we talk about media literacy and violence prevention work, we always are talking about, okay, let's be critical consumers of what we're seeing and what they're selling us and telling us, right? We want to do the exact same thing with porn. And it's not to shame people. I didn't mention this earlier, but I believe that porn literacy should be approached from a non-shaming, judgment-free type way, right? Because we want to arm them with the education and the knowledge to make informed decisions for themselves. If they want to watch porn, we really can't stop them. But I want young people to understand that what they're seeing in porn isn't real life, right? And I want them to be able to ask questions to help them better understand what they're actually seeing, right? That this isn't real life, that this is fantasy at the end of the day. So I want to talk a little bit about what are some of the things that we see in pornography and what that might, what we might think as a result of that, or what a young person might think. In porn, we might see these types of things. We might see people doing things without asking for consent. We might see only penetrative types of sex. We might see exaggerated gender roles, the fetishization of certain bodies, ethnic, racial groups, disabilities. We often don't see safer sex protection. I think we see sex for really long periods of times, and that happens because we see videos that are like an hour plus long, so people might think this is how long it is, right? Orgasms at the end of sex, or even violence. And excuse me, what this might make us think is that, one, we don't need to ask for consent. When I think about the young boy that told me all girls like to be choked during sex, we had to have a conversation, and I had to hold space for the fact that this young boy had never seen consent modeled to him, right? He never saw a porn star modeling consent with the other person, right? Negotiating boundaries, talking about what feels good, what they're comfortable with. All he's seeing is this action happen without consent. And as we all know as violence preventionists, right, consent is so much more than consent for sexual activities. But when it comes to sex, when we don't see that model to us, then of course it makes sense that young people are going to think that they don't actually need to ask for consent. It might make us think that sex is only defined as penis and vagina. As a queer person, sex is definitely not defined as only penis and vagina type sex, but that's what we're often seeing in pornography. And when we see queer sex, I think it's fetishized in a different way, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But this might make people think that, young people, right, that sex only has to exist this type of way. And if they're not engaging in this type of sex, that maybe something's wrong with them, that maybe they're not having real sex, that whatever the thought is, right? But it's really limiting when we always see in mainstream pornography, I'd say, is penis and vagina type sex. We see a whole lot of gendered stuff happening in pornography. And I should just know, as I'm talking about this list, right, I'm not, I'm not shaming pornography. I'm actually really pro sex work, and porn is like really buying or feeding into, I guess, the consumer, right? They know their audience and they're showing a really gendered type of sex that's happening. And it's because we live in a super gendered world and super binary world, right? So we see these really sexist tropes that happen sometimes in porn, like a woman being a maid, or, you know, the man is the mechanic coming over. And it's super gendered in the way that even people are having having sex together. For example, it's often shot from like this quote unquote male point of view. And so it's showing sex through a man's eyes rather than something that would be pleasurable maybe for all bodies. We might also think, or young people might also think, that it's okay to have sex with people because of their actual identity. And so this goes back to what I was previously talking about around like fetishization. I think a lot of porn that is not white, cis, straight, or able-bodied people, we are seeing a fetishization of other groups, right? We see a fetishization of Black communities, Indigenous communities, other people of color, right, disabled communities, and I would say also fat bodies, right? We're seeing this fetishization, and they're treated and talked about in pornography in a completely different way than we are seeing with cis-het, straight, able-bodied people. And that's really messed up. I have to like name that, right? Like that's terrible that we see this fetishization, because that really directly contributes to how people are navigating with other communities in their lives, right? We have to think about how, for example, the Atlanta shooting that happened in March was a direct result of fetishization and xenophobia and racism that Asian communities have experienced for all time, right? Especially within the United States. Well, that fetishization is also showing up in pornography, and that's problematic. And so we need to help young people understand that what they're seeing around other racial ethnic identities, disabled bodies, fat bodies is not okay, right? And that we shouldn't fetishize individuals. We also see that because we don't see protection, we might not need protection. And as we all know, safer sex options are important. Everyone gets to choose what works best for them, but it's important that they know that that's a thing that exists for them, right? And oftentimes we don't see, condoms being used or other types of barriers. I can't say I've ever seen a dental dam used in mainstream pornography. A dental dam being, right, like a piece of latex that would go over a vulva or an anus to perform oral sex. I can't say that I've actually seen that in mainstream pornography. And so young people are seeing that maybe they don't have to use safer sex protections. Again, that sex has to last a long time. And I think that this really can like create a lot of insecurities for young people who think that they have to go for hours at a time, that sex has to last for a certain period of time, right? And that if they don't get there, right, if they don't make it last as long, then there's something wrong with their bodies. And what they're missing, right, is that the director is telling these actors to stop and to reposition and to do this and to do that, right? And they stretch it out to become an hour-long feature, right? When in reality, sex doesn't last that long for most people. On average, I believe the number is around like 6 to 7 minutes for penetrative sex, like penis and vagina sex. And again, right, that's not the only type of sex that we see, but I think it creates this disillusion that sex is supposed to last for a really long time. And if you don't do that, you're not a good partner, which connects to the next piece. That one, we have to always have an orgasm, right? That it's the end goal of sex, and that if it doesn't happen, it wasn't good. Now, I know that there's a lot of talk in recent years about closing the orgasm gap, that people with vulvas tend to orgasm less than people with penises. And I do believe that we should close the orgasm gap. And I would also say that orgasm shouldn't be the end all be all of sex, right? Like we shouldn't put so much pressure on ourselves to either climax ourselves or to have our partners climax. Sex can be enjoyable without an orgasm. But I think there's a really large focus on it. And it's okay if that's something that's important to a person. But I think, again, it can create an insecurity where a young person might think, I'm a bad partner if I can't make my partner have an orgasm, right? Or maybe there's something wrong with me if I can't have an orgasm. And that's an unfair type of pressure to put on young people. And then lastly, sex has to be violent, right? Because we see violent themes in pornography, we might assume, or young people might assume, that sex has to be violent. I want to say that sex is not inherently a violent act. It's not, but the way that we see it in pornography can be violent. And so young people might think, this is what sex has to be, that it has to include choking, that it has to include other types of violence. And that's what it is. And I just have to accept that that is what sex is. And it doesn't have to be that way, right? Plenty of people are into kinky sex. where maybe violent themes are occurring and that's like a choice and people are consenting to that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I don't want young people walking away thinking that all sex has to be that way. I want them to make informed decisions for themselves. So these expectations are super unrealistic and inaccurate, which means that we might cause harm if we rely solely on them for porn or solely on porn for like our sex education, right? And when I say we, I'm talking young people as well, that if young people are relying completely on porn for their sex ed, then they might cause harm. And the reality is that a lot of people don't actually have good comprehensive sex education. I want to shout out my city, San Diego Unified School District actually has a really great comprehensive sex education program. It started, I believe, in like 2015, and I'm on an advisory board for it. And I'm really privileged and grateful to be part of that and to like contribute to the sex education that young people in the district are receiving. But I know that that's not the case in every place. And I know that everyone likes to act like California is the most progressive liberal state. And the reality is there are many places in California where sex education is not something that happens, even though we are supposed to receive it in our state because of the California Healthy Youth Act. But I think that sometimes schools will say, well, we tried to bring in a speaker and we couldn't get a speaker. And so we can't cover it this year. And that happened, I think, a few times with me where we had a grant for a certain part of San Diego. This was not for San Diego Unified, it was for another school district where I was providing violence prevention education. So, you know, our standard healthy relationships, consent and boundaries, et cetera. And when our grant ended, I had to inform them that, you know, it had ended. And I asked the health teacher, so who will you bring in then? And the health teacher was like, probably no one, because the school district's not going to pay for it. And if they can't get the free education, then they're just going to say, we tried, and that's it. So I know that not all students are getting the same type of comprehensive sex education throughout the country because it's not federally mandated and there's no like federal guidelines around it. There are, but again, the government doesn't totally follow that. So again, it's our job, right, to kind of do this type of sex education with them. But before we move forward and talk about how do we do this, I want us to consider what our biases are as educators. Why do we actually want to teach porn literacy? And what do we feel comfortable answering / talking about? So we're going to take it back to Mentimeter. Miranda, if you could drop that link one more time, just so folks can have it again, but I'm going to scooch on forward. I want to know, why do you want to teach porn literacy? And this is completely anonymous. So please be honest. Nobody's going to know who's saying what, but I'll give y'all a moment or so to tell me, why do you want to teach porn literacy? Because the students I teach are asking about it. Great answer, right? Because they're asking, and if they're asking, it's our job as adults to have those conversations. It seems to be a growing problem. Yeah, a lot of research has like noted, right? It's kind of hard to have a complete understanding of like how often young people are actually accessing pornography, but it does seem to be something that we should be talking about, right? Because I had zero sex ed from my parents and it really messed me up. Yeah, that's super, super fair, right? I think there is a generation of people who want to make sure the next generation don't repeat the generational cycles, right? Like I want the young people that I know in my life to have that proper sex education. And I got my sex ed from lots of different places. And I would say that my parents didn't really give me sex ed. They tried and I told them I knew everything, and I probably didn't at that age, but I felt really confident that I knew more than they probably thought I did. Because it's needed, because violence prevention, because it wasn't taught to me. Yeah, absolutely. If there's even this small limited research that indicates that it could potentially increase aggression, why wouldn't we address it as violence preventionists? We should be willing to have that conversation. / Stop the perpetuation of harmful stereotypes around sex and pleasure. Yes, absolutely. People conflate porn with, sorry, I'm moving my box, sexual violence. Yes, 100%. I want to make that really clear that I do not conflate them. Again, I am pro-sex work and I know porn stars. And I think it's important that young people understand, again, right, like what they're seeing isn't real life. And porn stars will tell you that. I know most people see sex for the first time in this way, so I want them to be fully informed before unhealthy assumptions become entrenched. Yes, absolutely. I want young people to make the best informed decisions for themselves. If that means that they're having sex with their partners at whatever age, but they're doing it in the safest way possible, right? In a way that practices consent, empathy, compassion, right? That's fine, but I want them to have the knowledge and to not rely solely on porn as their sex education. It is an important first step into getting to real conversations around consent, sexuality, and true body positivity. Yes, absolutely. Again, we don't see consent often modeled in pornography. And so I want young people to have those conversations. It shouldn't be ignored since students are accessing it. Teaching porn literacy could allow an opportunity to talk about real sexual education and healthy relationships, 100%, totally. And I think, sometimes when we think of all of this, we're like, okay, but like, how do we do this? How do we do it in an age appropriate way? How do we do it in a way that is, that like, even if we've never watched porn as like educators, like can still make sense, all of these questions, right? So let's start to talk about how do we actually do some porn literacy. And actually, before we move to that, I'm really impressed, honestly, that no one said anything like, because I think porn is bad. And if someone would have, or if someone is currently thinking that, that is okay to like have that thought. And I want to challenge people who do have that thought to really unpack that for themselves. What are our biases as educators and how does that show up in the classroom, right? I truly believe that like it's our job as preventionists to provide shame-free, trauma-informed education. And when it comes to any type of media literacy, right, I think it's on us to help them make those decisions for themselves and not us to impart like our biases onto them. You could be like anti-sex work and still do this in a neutral, unbiased way, right? I would want to unpack that though. I would want to talk about that a little bit more, right? But I think it's important to like recognize that sex work is just work, right? And I guess I'll give like a little anecdote that I remember being in a presentation and someone asking, like, well, what about sex workers that do sex work for survival, right? And I thought about my mom. My mom has worked in retail my entire life. And my mom doesn't enjoy her job. She does her job because it's her job and it puts, food on the table and it helps pay the bills. But my mom doesn't particularly enjoy her job in retail. It's just something that she does. I would say there are sex workers who also feel that way about their jobs. There are people who love their jobs, like me, and there are people that don't love their jobs, and that's okay. But I think it's important for us to like unpack our biases around sex work, and porn is a form of sex work, right? Before embarking on this type of like education with young people, because I think we can do more harm if we're approaching it from like a really negative way. Again, if you can separate that for yourself, I think then sure, you can do it. But I think it's really important to be able to present it in a neutral, unbiased way. So let's jump into the activities. We're at 11:04. I think this will carry us through, plus we'll have time for, fielding those questions, and then also some resources, and then time for a Q&A with me if that's helpful. So I have multiple activities and I'm going to walk you through how I would do them and show some examples, and then we're going to do a few together. But the first one I want to talk about is World Cafe. For those that are unfamiliar with World Cafe, essentially, if you were in person, you would have like, imagine 5 questions, 5 different tables, and at each table you'd maybe have like butcher paper or like flip chart, whatever, sticky notes, whatever you want to call it, and markers, and people would like get together and have a conversation about the question or the topic at hand. And then they would write on, this poster and then rotate. And then the next group would just like continue adding to the notes that are already there. And so you could do this in person using like Flipchart, or you could use Google Slides or Jamboard and break these into breakout rooms or small groups, alternating questions among groups. So I have these questions just as an example. And these are just questions to get them thinking, right? Is pornography healthy or unhealthy? Does it influence expectations people have of sex? How might it affect the person watching it? How could it affect a relationship? How might the use of pornography by one partner make the other partner feel? And is viewing pornography a good way to find out about sex? Does it realistically depict sex? You'll notice none of these questions have anything like sexually explicit, right? They're just value-based questions essentially. And so that's really my whole point of this like activities piece, or all of these, is like, how can we do porn literacy in a way that doesn't actually require us to look at porn? Because that's really real, right? And so I'm going to show you what my Jamboard looks like to give you an example of like how you could do this. So here's a Jamboard. If you've never seen one before, it is a free piece of Google. It's pretty simple to use, but you can think of this as like a large piece of butcher paper or sticky notes that you would do in person. You can do sticky notes over here on the left-hand side. You click one, or you can click on this and write your answer. They have multiple colors. I like colors, so I did different ones. But here's that first question that I was talking about, right? Is pornography healthy or unhealthy? Double tap on a sticky note to type your thoughts, or click on the sticky note on the left-hand side to add more. And then you can go through them. So I have 6 different sticky notes part of this, and these would just be, what they would go through and talk about with one another. And then they could add their thoughts in, and they can do this anonymously, right? Because they can do it through Google without someone ever knowing who they are. But this can be a really great way to kind of unpack what are their values around pornography first, right? If that's what you're interested in, like what are their thoughts on it, and how does it impact relationships? I think a lot of times, a lot of us want to approach it from like a healthy relationship standpoint, and that's super fair. So talk about, how does pornography potentially impact a relationship or not? What if one person really enjoys watching pornography and the other person doesn't? How do they engage in a conversation that is utilizing like healthy communication skills, right? To talk about these different things. Definitely many different questions you could ask, right? But this is just one example of what a like values-based type activity would look like. All right, let's go back to my PowerPoint. Does someone have a question? No? Okay, cool. All right, so then we could do a messages unpack. And you could use Google Slides, Jamboard, or Flipchart in person, but you can focus on themes. And so the themes that I think we often see in porn are like exaggerated gender roles, the lack of consent, what kind of bodies we're seeing, and heteronormativity, right? I'd say these are 4 really large themes that we often see in mainstream pornography. And so you can do multiple activities that kind of unpack how are these like showing up, right? Like what are young people thinking? And so some questions you could ask are, what do you think of the messages / expectations that we're seeing in porn? Or are they fair or realistic? Or how could these messages / expectations actually cause harm? So I'm going to show you another example of how to create this on Google. And this is, sorry, I'm gonna have to move some stuff around. This like other sticky note type activity, this is through Google Slides. I have to shout out Sarah Orton and Jessie Town Cardenas, who like helped, who like used this in one of their trainings, and then I ended up using it and I thought it was really helpful. But essentially, I created like all these, I put these different notes right into these sticky notes. So what messages are we learning from pornography? One partner's pleasure is prioritized over the others, must enjoy what a partner does in bed. Pleasure primarily comes from penetrative sex. Sex always ends in an orgasm. Breasts, penises, and butts have to look a certain way / be a certain size. Boundaries aren't discussed. Partner is always willing / ready to have sex. Genitals are hairless. Sex has to last a long time. One partner makes the first move and controls the situation. People are sexually fluid / open to sex with multiple people, and only thin, fit, or able-bodied bodies are displayed. These are some of the things that we kind of talked about previously, right? But then you can break them up into individual sticky notes and have people go in and write their answers. And so I actually did this with a group at a college virtually, and I'm going to show you some of their responses. And it led to like a wonderful conversation where we really unpacked and like talked about what are these messages teaching us and how do they influence us. So these ones are the ones that I did with this group. And so, you know, when we have this idea of one partner's pleasure is prioritized over the others, what is it teaching us? People name the pleasure gap. They said that it taught them that sex is meant to serve your partners and not for your own / mutual pleasure. Both people can't have pleasure at the same time. That mutual pleasure is not important, right? And pleasure is important. I know I said that orgasm isn't the end all be all, and I don't think it is. You can have super pleasurable sex without an orgasm. But if we're only prioritizing one partner's pleasure over the other, all of these things are coming up. And so this was a college group, I will admit. You know, high schoolers might not have the same type of thoughts, but I thought it was so insightful for us to have this conversation around what does pleasure look like then? How do we determine that people are experiencing pleasure? How do we know, right? What can we do to make sure that it's a pleasurable experience for all people involved? There are some other ones, right, that came up, like, you know, you must enjoy what your partner does in bed. So if you don't enjoy sex or any part or type of sex, that you're weird. And we were like, yeah, that's a really great point, right? That like, if you don't enjoy this one particular sex act, then that means that there's something wrong with you, or that's kind of the message that is conveyed to us in this process. And that can really shut down all communication. It could shame people or prude shame people, right? But like there were so many insightful things that they had said. And so these were just some of the examples that, that had come up when we were talking about this. And I thought it was really awesome because one, it was anonymous. And yeah, you could do this in person with sticky notes, but I really liked that this gave them the ability to just like share what they wanted to without fear of like their classmates knowing. I'm trying to think if there was some other ones, right? Like sex always ends in an orgasm. So then it leads to people faking their orgasms. It neglects how some people can't have orgasms. Shout out Prozac. I was really happy that someone mentioned that, like, you know, some SSRIs can absolutely impact our abilities to have sex with people, right? To either become lubricated, to maintain an erection, or to even climax. And I was like, yeah, this is real sex, right? This is the stuff that we should be talking about. And again, this was with a college student or college group, right? And so I know something that came up earlier when I asked, what are your concerns, is how do you figure out what's age and developmentally appropriate? And there are toolkits online from SIECUS, which is the Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States. They have like an entire guide on like what you should be talking about in K through 12. So like, you know, in kindergarten, we wouldn't be talking about sex like we all know, but we'd be talking about consent and boundaries and like, you know, personal space and personal bubble. And so when it comes to high schoolers, we'd be talking about the things that we already are talking about, right? And if they bring the things up to us, I think it's okay for us as sex educators to acknowledge those things, right? I think sometimes young people surprise us more than we think they're going to. I remember having a conversation when I was teaching about consent and boundaries, and a high schooler, this person was a senior, shared information, not about themselves, but they were just sharing information about like kink and poly. And I was just like, yeah, these are things that like people know about. So why aren't we talking about that? So, you know, again, these things come up, and I really appreciated that desirability politics came up. So for those that don't know, desirability politics are really how we are influenced to be attracted to certain types of bodies. We cannot ignore how capitalism, how colonialism, how white supremacy has influenced all of us to find certain bodies more attractive than others. And that's maybe uncomfortable to hear, but it's the reality is that we have all been influenced. So when people say, it's just my preference, I don't date fat people, well, we have to unpack why do we not value fat bodies in society? And I say that as like a fat person, right? So I think it's important for us to unpack how has oppression really shown up in the way that we either fetishize certain bodies, or that we devalue those bodies, or that we only value certain bodies, right? And how does that show up for young people and the relationships that they have? So much that you could do with this type of like messaging, or this type of activity, right? And getting at like, what are we learning, right? Because they're telling you, these are the things that we're getting from this idea of like, breast, penises, and butts have to look a certain way / be a certain size. So you are helping them, like you're facilitating this conversation, right? But as the educator, you're giving them the opportunity to share out what their thoughts are. So I just wanted to share this activity because I think it can be a really helpful way to like talk about porn literacy. And then let's go back to the PowerPoint. And I'm actually going to pause here and see if there are any questions that came up in the chat, Miranda.
There was definitely appreciation for you lifting up the link to racism and white supremacy. And some folks had mentioned they don't have anxiety necessarily about talking about this and doing this work, but they're concerned about the pushback from leadership and from school districts.
Yes, super, super fair. Before I move forward, I think maybe it's helpful to know that I have not done this type of education in a school district that like requested it from me. So often when I've done porn literacy, it's been because a youth serving organization in San Diego has reached out to us, and we send them kind of like a menu of different topics we can cover, and porn literacy is one of them. And that's when they're like, oh yes, please come in. We don't know how to talk about this. They're asking us all these questions. Please come in. So I want to fully disclose that like it is a privilege that we've been able to do that as an organization, is to send a menu to other orgs and say, here's what we can present on, and they get to choose. Most of the times the schools aren't going to ask. And I would say that San Diego Unified has their sexual health education program. So they kind of have a way of like approaching different topics. But you can definitely, like, I think having the buy-in from leadership is really important. And maybe we can get to that a little bit at the end, but having leadership support is important. And also sometimes you can do first and then ask for forgiveness later, which is something that I have done. And maybe that's a huge privilege. I recognize that. But I think like knowing like, right, how this connects to violence prevention is really what's important at the end of the day. But we can talk about that a little bit more at the end. So now here's my favorite part of doing porn literacy, using actual media. But Sarah, how do you use media without actually showing porn? You can. It's a little hard, but we can totally do it. And I'm going to show you how you do it. But you can use different media clips to look at some media examples that include messages or expectations about sex. Again, really important. You are not actually using pornography, but you're using maybe clips where the characters are talking about porn, or they're sharing misinformation that they learned about sex that maybe they learned in pornography, right? And so this is a little bit harder of a route to do. I will fully admit that. And I have to shout out my team. At the time, we had 4 educators who combed the internet for different clips. We like went through tons of media show, like movies, TV shows, etc., trying to find clips where like sex education was happening or conversations around porn were happening. And then we have a wonderful volunteer who edited all of our videos for us, captioned all of our videos for us. So if you have the ability to bring in a video editor, I highly recommend it. This person was doing it as a volunteer project because they were applying to like a film school. And so they wanted to build their portfolio and they were willing to do it. But if you can pay your interns, right, I always want to advocate for that. And right, that's how we were able to get the really nice quality clips that we're going to get, because there were some clips where they would say like a curse word or they would say something really problematic. And I was like, yeah, that's never going to fly in a classroom, because then the conversation is going to become about that specific thing. Right. So we had to think creatively. And so our like film volunteer edited clips like so seamlessly. So I want to shout out Akira. No, she's not watching this, but I'm just really grateful for Akira doing all of this work for us and making it like look so great. So I'm going to show you I think we have enough time to like watch all 4 of them. So you can just kind of have an idea of like what these videos look like. And then I'm going to ask you to tell me what are the themes you notice. And then I'll share some of the themes that I'm noticing. But the first one is from the movie Booksmart. And I'm going to give a little bit of context first in case anybody's never seen Booksmart. It centers around 2 teenagers who are in their senior year of high school. It's the day before graduation. They're going to a party. I can't remember their names. I think it's Amy and Molly. I think it's Amy. Amy is super crushing on a person named Ryan, and they're both 2 young girls. So I just want to name that because what follows will make sense if you understand that she's talking about another girl. So let's go ahead and play it.
Dude, we're gonna get to Nick's so late. It's fine. Everybody shows up to parties late. It's cooler to be late. We're gonna arrive right at the crest. Before you know it, you'll be neck deep in Ryan. Neck deep in what direction? Can you tell me? I don't know. I don't know anything. I'm really stressed about it. I'm okay. I know you are. If only there was just video. People looking up. Sorry, are you talking about? All I'm saying, no one would know if you watched one porn one time. Think of it as a documentary. It's just a sexy documentary. It's a hot doc. All of those women are European trafficking victims. I thought you were a sex positive feminist. Are you insane? Principal Chris Roy. I have headphones. 4 feet away. I have headphones, madam. Right, but once we get a sense of the mechanics, I am shutting it off real quick. Of course. It's for educational purposes.
I love this video, and I love the kind of like head tilt at the end to like understand the mechanics of what is queer sex, right? So before I share what I pick up on that video, I would love people to either unmute or put in the chat, what are some themes that you're seeing that you're like, oof, we need to talk about those. So go ahead and again, unmute or put it in the chat. Okay, so someone says shame of watching porn. Her saying no one is gonna know if you watch porn one time. Yes, absolutely. That porn is kind of bad and that we shouldn't be watching it. Christine says exactly. Arthi had said the earlier statement. Jennifer says porn is not a documentary. It's a scripted movie. Absolutely. Hi, Jennifer. Yes, absolutely. It is a scripted movie. It's fantasy, right? But they say specifically, it's a hot doc. Anything else come up for y'all that you noticed? Holly says porn's the place to learn what queer sex looks like. Yes, and as we know, a lot of mainstream queer sex is really exaggerated. It's super fetishized, right? And so it's not going to maybe accurately depict what real queer sex looks like. And they're relying on that for their sex education. And it's because comprehensive sex ed, one, would never teach young people how to actually have sex, but they're not even talking about queer sex at all, right? Like queer sex protections or like any of those pieces. Let's see, video of people hooking up. Yeah, I think I understand what you mean, Arthi. But all of these, let's see, there's another one. Brittany says, I thought it was impressive that she understood that there could be a connection to sex trafficking with porn, and she was worried about that. Do you talk about sex trafficking when addressing porn literacy with youth? Yes, I do actually. But I make the distinction that sex trafficking is not sex work, that sex work is a type of work that people are consenting to, that people are doing because they want to. Remember, I shared the example that not everybody loves their jobs, but some people do, and that's okay. And sex trafficking is different. And you know, that idea that like sex or porn is sex trafficking like victims, like European sex trafficking victims, also is something that we should be unpacking with young people too, right? Like, what are ideas of people who are being trafficked? And why is it that the media sells us this idea that it's like only a certain race that's experiencing trafficking, or that it's only happening overseas in Europe? In fact, a lot of trafficking happens here in the United States. And in San Diego, it's a problem because we have a high military presence. And I think that's really important to note. It's a tourist city and there's a really large population of military bases out here. And so I think a lot of people assume because it's San Diego that it's a border issue. In fact, it's not. It's a domestic issue that's often exacerbated by the military in San Diego. And so I think that's really uncomfortable to name, but also really important to name, right? And so that is something that I do unpack with youth, and I want them to understand that sex trafficking is different than sex work. But yeah, these are some of the things that I came up with. Let's move to that. One, Molly pressures Amy into actually watching porn in the first place. There's like no consent happening there, right? Molly's like, you know, I've got headphones, and it seems like Amy gives this reluctant yes. And as we all know, if it's not a heck yes, it's a heck no, right? She doesn't seem like she's super excited to do this, and she's kind of pressured and uncomfortable because her principal is literally in the front seat driving them. And so it's showing a lack of consent. And that is a conversation we should be having with young people. Again, what y'all mentioned, right? This educational documentary, this hot doc, that porn is for entertainment and not education. And then again, of course, the European sex trafficking victims. And then someone else had asked me, hi, Sarah, you mentioned earlier that there's a toolkit with tips on how to discuss these topics with K through 12 students. Where can I find this? So I'm going to just drop the name. I'll have to, if I can find it, I'll send it to Miranda, but it's a really lengthy toolkit. It's from SIECUS. SIECUS stands for Sexuality Information Education Council of the United States. So if you look up SIECUS, K through 12, guidelines, you should be able to find it, but I think I have it saved and I can send it to Miranda to send out. Cool. All right. So these are some of the things that came up in the film Booksmart. Let's move to another film. And this next one is from Easy A. I know this is a little dated. Again, really hard to find media clips where porn wasn't happening, but I want to give a little context as well. So you're going to see, I think it's Olive, and I can't remember his name, but they're faking having sex because he recently, I think, was outed at school. And so he wants people to believe that he's straight. So he is pretending to engage in straight sex. And you'll see what comes of that.
What are you doing? Can you come here, please? Jack and I, come on. All right. Come on, check. All right. Now grunt, and make it convincing. It's a grunt, not whine. Just grunt.
Phone, like sex noises.
God, you are pathetic.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Ready for the grand finale?
Yeah, what?
Oh yeah.
Go forth, my son. You're a man now.
Thank you. Seriously.
All right, so I first want to note that this clip is, I don't know how long we did. I think we did a minute and a half. It's 5 minutes of them making fake sex sounds. So I had to, Akira edited it for us. But I want to know, what are some of the things that you noticed that came up in this minute and a half clip? What were the themes that you were noticing? And thank you, Miranda, for dropping the guidelines in the chat. Let's see, that there's a sound for guys when they have sex. Yes, it's teaching us that sex has to sound like a certain way. And if you've ever watched mainstream porn, you will definitely know that the sounds are largely, like Zoe is saying, largely based on porn. It's all about the climax, making sex into a production. Sex is not without orgasms. The orgasm is the big finale, right? Yes, all of these things are like what we're noticing. Some things that I noticed in particular, though,
What are you doing?
one, okay, like we shared the sex noises that we have to sound a certain way or put on a performance for it to be good. The fake orgasm, that in order for sex to be good, it has to end in a big climax, especially for the man. And that violence is ultimately part of sex, right? She like punches him right in the gut. And while we know that this is like a production right now, this, right, like they're putting on a show essentially, right? Violence, we're learning as the audience, like the actual audience of the film, that violence is something that's incorporated into sex. And someone had asked, and the people viewing, yeah, that like people are kind of like peeping through this little hole, right? Which I think is like, we have a long history in media of like peeping toms, right? And that being like a funny type joke, even though that's not right, unless someone gives explicit consent, that's not a consensual act, right? Someone else said, Miranda said that it's a rite of passage and now he's a man. Yeah, it creates this like sex as status, right? That like he's gonna get cheered on for having sex. Because if you, spoiler alert, haven't seen the movie, the whole thing is, right, like she gets branded with the scarlet letter essentially, right? It's kind of like a remake of that. A modern version of that, if you will. And he becomes like cheered on, right? He's the big man on campus because he now is no longer a quote unquote virgin, right? But she is shamed for having sex and is literally branded with this like scarlet letter. And it reinforces shame in being gay or out. I know that this is a dated movie. So maybe it wouldn't feel as like relevant now. Young people might say, yeah, but nobody like is shamed for being queer in the same way. I would say it really depends on where you live and what kind of community you're in, right? Maybe in like more, I would say city-like areas in California, sure, maybe that's not an issue in San Francisco or San Diego or even LA, but you have to think about like where you're at, right? And so it's reinforcing the shame that being queer, being out isn't something that is okay. And he lies, right, about his sexuality, which is, I understand why someone does that. I get it. As a queer person, I 100% get that. And it's reinforcing that we have to keep that like a secret, and that by having straight sex, right, that we pass and then we don't have to worry about our safety. So let's keep it going. I have 2 more videos and it's 11:32. Yeah, I think we can do it. Let's do it. So this is from the show Sex Education. I don't think I need any context for this one. I think it makes sense, yeah.
I just want to know how it feels. Yeah. Have you done it?
Not all the way, but I do watch quite a lot of porno.
Show me.
You don't want to see gay porn?
I definitely do.
It's called rimming.
Looks fun. What do you think it feels like?
What, rimming?
No, sex.
I don't know. I think it'll be nice. It feels good to wank, so it must be like that, but better. And doing it with someone who likes you must be awesome because they really get you. Maybe the 2 of you become one, like the Spice Girls said. Oh.
So for time's sake, I'm just gonna go ahead and share some of the things that I noticed in it, just because I want to make sure we get pieces. But one, I think something that's really nice is there is no judgment from Lily to Eric. And I love this saying. It's like my favorite saying as a sex educator: don't yuck people's yums, right? And she doesn't yuck his yum for like being into what is considered a different sex act, right? It's not like penis and vagina. But she does ask Eric what it feels like. And when Eric says rimming, she says no sex. So it's interesting though, because she's not yucking his yum, but she's also not equating that type of sex act as a real sex act, right? There's a heteronormative assumption here. And so rimming is sex. It's not just penis and vagina that counts as sex. But that was something that I really liked from that clip. That clip does show nudity. We had to edit it out. But again, right, you can get creative. And the final video I want to show you, again, a very dated video, but I think it really hits at a lot of different things. And it's from Superbad.
Hey, so did you bring a condom for tonight?
You brought a condom with you?
Yeah, I figured I might as well, you know. I brought a little bottle of spermicidal lube, too.
But you laughed in my face when I said I'd be having sex tonight.
Yeah, that doesn't mean you shouldn't just always be prepared. You know, you didn't even bring a condom?
No, Evan, that wasn't part of the plan. I can't believe you did this without consulting with me about it.
Why are you talking about a plan? We've never discussed like any plan, but you keep saying we have a plan.
I had like a general outline, you know? I was gonna go down on her for like several hours, okay? She would love that. She'd be smitten by that. She'd go out with that. Or I'd dry hump the of her leg.
Okay, well, I don't see the harm in bringing one little condom.
And one little bottle of spermicidal lube?
Yeah, one little bottle of spermicidal lube.
These girls are 18 years old. They're not dried up old ladies. They're good to go.
Then I won't bring the lube. Don't make me feel like that. I thought it was cool.
Again, for time's sake, I'm going to go ahead and share my thoughts. Grace, I see your question. I'm going to answer that more towards the end because I think it's an important conversation, but we'll get to that towards the end. But one, Seth makes Evan feel really bad about bringing a condom and lube. And I would say he is prepared, right? Like Evan is coming prepared. He knows that there's a potential that he might be engaging in sex that night. And he even brings lube, which is fantastic. And Seth makes him feel really bad about it. There's this idea that sex has to last a really long time, right? Seth makes the comment that he's going to go down on someone for hours. I do appreciate that they bring up dry humping because dry humping can be a really like fun, pleasurable sex act for people that's low risk, right? That there's like, especially if clothes are on, it's a low risk activity. But there's a misconception that young people would not need lube. And he makes a really like ageist comment, right? About like old ladies. And he is saying that, you know, they're 18 years old. They're not dried up old ladies. Well, one, again, ageist. And also two, being lubricated doesn't mean that someone is consenting to any type of activity, right? And so I think I've heard that come up quite a lot with the young people that I've worked with, that like someone who's wet is like consenting. And I think that got exacerbated last summer when Cardi and Meg the Stallion came out with WAP, right? And so I feel like that really exacerbated this like conversation of like having a wet ass pussy means that you are consistently consenting to sex, right? So those were the clips, right? And those are just 4 examples. I'm sure you all have probably seen media where you're like, ooh, that would be a really good unpack. Remember it, record the timestamps, right? Like I had to sit down and record timestamps and then send them to our film volunteer so that she could edit them for me. But if you have that ability to do that, I think it makes for a much more engaging way because then they get to actually see media. And some of them might be like, yeah, this is really dated. Nobody like thinks about that anymore. Well, let's still unpack it. Let's talk about like how this could come up again, right? And how it's still problematic. And you can also use media in a different way. You can use Disney, yes, Disney. And so it's important to think about the themes like in Disney movies and how they influence how we view sex. I think something that comes up in Disney quite often, right, is like no consent, the exaggerated gender roles, violence, heteronormativity, but also bodies, who is desirable and who is fetishized. I want to share a personal story. So when I was growing up, I was a kid during the 90s. And so my favorite princesses were Princess Jasmine, Pocahontas, and Esmeralda from The Hunchback of Notre Dame. If you'll notice, if you know anything about Disney, those are the 3 women of color, actually I should say girls of color in the 90s that existed that were like brown. And as a Latina, I was like, I want to be like them. But as a young person, I already knew that they were sexualized. I maybe didn't have the language for it, but I thought they were sexy and I thought that they looked good and they were sexy. They wore more revealing clothing. They had more shapely bodies. They didn't look like little girls like Snow White or even Ariel. They looked like grown women and they're not. They're actually young teenagers, I believe, right? And Pocahontas, we know there's like so much problematic stuff around that. But even as a young person, I was like, I want to be these people because they were sexualized in a way that I thought was really cool. And other white princesses aren't, right? And this was like during the early 90s when these movies came out and I was super into them, but there's so much you can unpack with Disney around the messages that it's teaching us regarding all of these like themes that we see in porn, right? Without ever even using porn. So you are going to actually have access to all of like my activities. And I'll share that in a little bit, but here are the takeaways that I want us as facilitators to impart on the young people that we work with. One, porn isn't about realistic depictions of sex, love, and intimacy. It's ultimately fantasy, right? It is a media industry that is all about money, right? We cannot separate that this is a capitalistic industry, right? That it's all about capital at the end of the day. And I don't want young people to walk away from our classes thinking that, oh my God, I have to stop watching porn, right? I would never tell a young person to stop watching any form of media, but I want them to ask the questions, what messages am I being told or sold? Who is porn really for? What's missing in porn? And sex sells, but what kind of sex sells, right? I want them to think about these questions as they're engaging in any type of media or interacting or engaging with any type of media in their lives, right? Whether that's song lyrics, that's movies, TV shows, magazines, etc. I love this image. It's from Hazel Mead. I use a different activity when I do this with youth. If they're not college students, I'll ask them, if porn was realistic, what would you see? And they'll name out a bunch of different things. But some of the things on here that I really love are like, you know, lube or vaginismus or erectile dysfunction or water breaks or sweat or pimply bums or like queefs or discussion of consent, awkward position changes, right? These are normal things that happen in sex that we often don't actually see in pornography, in mainstream pornography. And I guess the last thing that I would want them to walk away with is that whether they have never had sex, they have had sex, or they're using porn for fun, sex should always be consensual. It's for all bodies. It can be defined however you want, and it should be pleasurable, right? It doesn't have to end in orgasm, but sex should be something that we engage in because it feels good and because we genuinely like that. And I say that to young people. I want them to make an informed choice about sex and to know that sex is something that we do, not only for reproduction, but because it genuinely feels good. And there's nothing wrong with telling that to young people. So let's jump into the fielding difficult questions, because I know it's 11:41, so I want to make sure I have time to go through some other stuff with y'all. But those are the activities, right? So now, how do we field the difficult questions? So questions that are, I think, that come up, but are typically like, they're probably about learning at the end of the day, right? Like they're trying to learn something, but they might come about it or go about it in a different way. So they might use like shock factor questions. So is it okay to choke someone without their consent? I saw it in porn, right? They're just trying to like shock you into your answer. They might use slang. Does a WAP mean someone gives consent? So you might not feel comfortable saying wet ass pussy in a classroom. That's super fair. You can say, so we're going to say like a lubricated vagina. That's medically accurate terminology, right? They should know medically accurate terminology. They might ask you a personal question. Do you watch porn? They might ask you a values-based question. Is it okay to watch porn? Or they might do like a combo of all of them, right? And so I would say, first and foremost, don't answer personal questions. My role as a sex educator is you can ask me anything about sex. You just can't ask me about my sex life. You can't ask me personal questions about sex, but you can ask me about, you know, appropriate questions, right? And I'll determine if it's appropriate or not. So because I use Mentimeter, I kind of field my questions through Mentimeter to determine if I'm gonna answer something. So for example, back in the spring, someone had asked a question of like, how do you pleasure your partner? I don't know what to do, or something like that. And this person was talking about someone with like a vagina. And I was like, that's a great question. And I was like, I don't know what your partner likes. You probably have to ask your partner, right? And there's no way that I can tell you what's going to feel good for one person, because what feels good for one person might not feel good for another person, right? And that's an actual answer to a question, right? I'm not asking them or telling them anything inappropriate, but I am telling them that communication is always going to be important, right? Consent is always going to be important. If you think there is a learning moment to be had, reframe the question and answer it. And that's what I do, right? If I get a question that I'm like, let me sit with it, let me think about it, right? How can I answer this in a way that is actually educational? If it's just shock factor, or it's, you know, they're doing it to like be a goofball or inappropriate, you don't have to answer those questions. And it's also okay to say, I don't know all the answers. Like any topic, it's okay to tell youth, I don't know the answer, but let me check in and get back to you, right? And kind of going back to this slang idea that like, they might teach you new slang for different words or for different body parts or acts, right? But it's also important that they know the medically accurate terminology too, because they, right, like they should be able to say vulva or vagina or penis or scrotum without like bursting into fits, right? And like that's our hope as sex educators, is to teach young people their body parts at really early ages, right? Because we don't like laugh about our elbows, we just call it an elbow. So here is the link to the resources that has all of the things that I've been talking about. And I want to actually show that to you. Let me share my screen and show you what you're going to have access to. So in this resource folder that Miranda is going to send to you is the activity Unpacking Messages in Mainstream Pornography, which is this one. They're locked, but you can make a copy for yourself. There's the activity World Cafe, which is this one. Again, you can make a copy for yourself. There is a porn literacy handout that we have created here at CCS that you can absolutely use. There is the literature review I was talking about, Young People's Pornography Use and Sexual Health Attitudes, Development and Behavior, a literature and scoping review document if you'd like to look it over. And then lastly, there is a resources for porn literacy document that I kind of put together. So again, our handout, some articles, lesson plans, some information from the Boston University School of Public Health. So they had actually developed a porn literacy curriculum from a violence prevention framework. Dr. Emily Rothman had come from doing domestic violence work and then went into was doing it through public health, right? And so this is how she has approached it. Some additional things, and then another resources list that I wasn't going to reinvent, but this is an entire other document about addressing porn and sex education that everyone can have access to. So these are all of my resources that you're going to get in this one main folder that Miranda will provide to y'all. But I'm going to go back to my PowerPoint, and I think I have one final question from you, which is, what's one thing you learned? And I'd love to do that on Menti. And then I'm going to pause so that we can get to any questions y'all have. So let me pull that up one more time. Here is Menti. What is one thing that you learned from this presentation? It's helpful for me to know. And then we'll take some time for questions. Thank you. Amazing talking points and strategies. Thanks. I'd love to know just, the things that y'all are taking away from this: approachable, appropriate, and relatable ways to talk about porn with youth. Fantastic. Any other thoughts? You can keep plugging them in. I do want to name, let's see, we have learned a ton about how educators can and do share information in a positive and supportive way. This is so great as we are seeing prevention from a policy lens. Yeah, awesome. And y'all can keep adding to that. I want to actually address, I'm going to look through the chat really quick to see if there are any questions that came up for me. I know that Grace had asked one question in particular, so let me just glance at this really quickly. Let's see, Grace's question was, as an aside, do you address, if at all, paying for porn with young people you support, meaning appropriately compensating the people whose work they're watching? Great, great question. This is, let me take a sip because my throat. This is, I think, really nuanced conversation, because I firmly believe that sex workers should get paid and that we can access queer feminist porn in ethical ways, right? That also compensates the performer, make sure that there's safety in line for the performer, that they're not being trafficked, right? That there's a lot of safeguards in place. And I think that that is important, and that we should pay sex workers for their work, right? It's another form of work. And the reality is, I don't know many people under the age of 18 who would be able to ask family members for a credit card to use on a website, right? And OnlyFans, while accessible and something that they could probably do on their own, also is like not perfect, right? Because if you watched Adam, I think it's Adam Dodge's like end tab like presentation on OnlyFans, he does a whole thing about how like it's hard to honestly know if like people aren't being trafficked on OnlyFans. Like there's just no way to like really realistically know. I would love to have more conversation with people about this, because how do we encourage young people to pay for a service while also recognizing that young people just don't typically have money, right? Like they barely have enough money to like go to the movies sometimes with their friends. And I think depending on where you're living, they might not have that type of extra income to like to use for pornography. So it's a great question. And I've had that conversation with young people that like, you know, in a real world, in an ideal world, we would pay for porn, like we would pay for any type of service. And I just know that that's not the reality. And that's why mainstream porn is so successful, right? Because it's free, it's accessible, and you can watch porn whenever you want without anyone knowing and get it for free. And so it's a nuanced conversation. I want to acknowledge that. And I don't think I'm giving a perfect answer to that, but I think you can have those conversations with young people too, right? Let's see, aside from the income issue, how do you teach young people the skills necessary to purchase, navigate ethical porn? That's a great question. I don't always get to have that conversation depending on what like we're doing in the lesson. But with college students, I will kind of give them a breakdown of like what ethical like pornography looks like. Like how do we actually like go about purchasing ethical pornography, and I will give them a list of different websites to check out. But I do that with people who are over the age of 18, who are college students. Most of the time they're over the age of 18, right? But they're in college. I would not give out a list of like porn to young people under the age of 18 who are in high school. I think that, as you can imagine, there would be a lot of issues around that. And sex educators already come under so much fire. There was a sex educator in New York who was teaching, I think, about porn literacy to her students, and parents like got really upset, and she resigned from her agency or from the school district. I think she was there as like a school employee. And I have to say, I'm really privileged that my organization supports me in the work that I do, that they trust me, that they know that my area of expertise is human sexuality. And like, I know that like if I were to share links to porn websites, I don't think that they could back me up on that. And I don't think that that would be the right thing to do either with like people who are in high school. And so I think it's about getting them to talk. You can talk about with them, like, how do you do this in an ethical way, right? But more than anything, I feel like I'm trying to get them to unpack like the messages that they're seeing in the moment about porn, or that they're hearing about from their friends, right? And how does that impact the relationships they're having, or the sexual experiences that they're having rather. I don't see any, I'm gonna stop sharing, but just so everyone sees right here, this is my anonymous question box, and I don't have any questions there, which is totally okay. But I want to create the room for people to ask me any questions that they have, or, you know, if you want to private message me, if you don't want to do it publicly, you can, or if you want to put it back in Mentimeter, you can do that and I can check it. No one else will see it. But I want to, you know, we have like 7 minutes. I want to make sure that if folks have questions, they have the time to ask me. Let's see. How did I get into this work? Great question. I have always been really interested in human sexuality, and I was interested in it at a really young age. And actually at the age of 15, I told my parents I wanted to be a Playboy bunny. And to which my dad said, become a doctor, like a medical doctor, and then you can do whatever you want. And that kind of was the theme of growing up, was like, become a doctor and then you can do whatever you want. And eventually I didn't want to be a Playboy bunny anymore, but I wanted to be a sex therapist. And I went to a program and got placed into the sex education track and not their sex therapy program. And through that, I kind of really focused on like violence prevention in my graduate program. And so that's kind of how I ended up working at a dual rape crisis center, DV organization in San Diego. But I, again, firmly believe you can't do violence prevention without doing comprehensive sex ed, and you can't do comprehensive sex ed without also doing violence prevention. They go together. And I'm hoping that, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years, we see much more of these fields like merging together rather than being two separate fields. But yeah, that's kind of my passion around like doing this type of work. Thanks for asking. How can these conversations include youth's awareness and attention on sites like OnlyFans? Yeah, you can definitely have a conversation about that. I haven't had that explicit conversation with youth, I would say like that are not college students yet. But, you know, work into the conversation that like what they're seeing in OnlyFans is also can be just it's a form of entertainment, right? And that like, there's also consent that should be practiced in OnlyFans, right? Like we shouldn't be taking pictures or screenshotting pictures of people's things that they're sending to us, right? We shouldn't be doxing them and like outing them and putting out all of their information, as what happened with, I think it was the EMT last year in New York, who had all of her information doxed and then she was let go from her job. But like her being an EMT and doing OnlyFans, that's like two different things, right? And she shouldn't be penalized for it, but she was. And so you can have that conversation with young people about like what OnlyFans is, how it can potentially create harm, how to like practice like navigating consent in that. I think, you know, you're going to have to really, it depends on your audience and like the population you're working with, right? Like in terms of like how conservative or not it is. Again, I want to mention that like no school district has necessarily brought us in to talk about this, but it's always been youth serving organizations. So if you're doing violence prevention work for youth serving orgs and you say, hey, we can do this, I bet you they're going to take you up on it because their youth are talking about it with them and they're not trained in it. They don't know how to actually have these conversations. And it's okay if you're like, sex ed isn't like my, you know, area of expertise. That's okay. You're a violence preventionist. You already know and understand how to unpack themes in media to like relate to this content. And you can totally do that with this work too. No problem. I'm gonna drop my email in the chat in case anyone has questions and they don't want to answer or ask them publicly. That's okay. I am checking my Menti. I have no additional questions from y'all. So here's my email. Please feel free to like hit me up, ask me questions. I'm like here for you. I want you to feel confident to implement like porn literacy into your violence prevention work, right? And like, again, like I shared, I think having leadership buy-in is really important and being able to tell them, this is how it connects. This is why it's important. Even if it's not something that's like in your actual like standard curriculum, but it's like an additional thing that you do, right? Because like we have a standard curriculum that's like 4 series or 4 lessons, but then we offer a bunch of other topics. Even if you offer it, right, some people will take you up on that. It doesn't have to be a main thing, but you could incorporate it into your media literacy already if you have it, right? You just have to be creative of how you go about it. And, you know, I think just sharing with leadership, like these are the facts. This is what we know, right? This is how we can do it in an age and developmentally appropriate way. This is how we can do it without ever even showing media, right? These are conversations that young people are having, so we should be having them with them. So yeah. Thank you all so much for being here. Miranda, I don't know if you want to close out, but thank you all so much for your time and attention. You'll get lots of resources. Please hit me up if you have questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I know you and I have had this conversation a lot of times, so I really appreciate you being willing to do a webinar on it because it is very prescient. And I know that it's a question that I've talked through a lot with preventionists over the last year, especially. I think COVID definitely created more space where, you know, and everyone learning from home that, okay, these are conversations that we need to start jumping into and not be so afraid of, because there are absolutely age appropriate ways to have it. And really coming from that sex positive and trauma informed and shame-free space is so important. So thank you so much. Like Sarah has shared, I will be sending out all of the resources as well as a recording of the webinar. There will also be a brief survey on there for our feedback. We all know that evaluation is a key component of prevention, so I just have to plug that. But thank you so much. And I will include Sarah's email. I'll CC you on the follow-up email so that if folks have questions, and then you can absolutely get connected. So thank you everyone for your time.